Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Guidebooks tend to be utilitarian things, paper bricks that we crammed into our backpacks when wandering the world in the analog era. But every once in a while, I come across one that changes the way I travel. Europe by Rail is a beautifully published book that covers 50 key rail routes across Europe, blending practical advice with narrative storytelling and a focus on slow travel by local train. You'll also find country information, offbeat diversions, sidebars on historic railway stations, and tips on fares and ticketing that'll help you navigate Europe's complex rail network. This wonderful resource has been inspiring travel dreams for over 30 years. The 18th edition was published in October 2024. This is one of my favorite guidebooks, and I'm happy to be able to share it with you today. Co-authors Nicky Gardner and Suzanne Kreis are Berlin-based writers with a passion for slow travel and sustainable tourism. They were also co-editors of Hidden Europe magazine from 2005 to 2023. Nicky joined me to talk about spontaneity versus pre-planning, the pros and cons of rail passes, and the return of night trains. Personal Landscapes relies on the support of listeners like you to keep going. If you want to keep it paywall-free and ad-free, please consider joining my members club. You'll support the show and get cool book lover bonuses for what it would cost to buy a fancy coffee once a month. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com, where you'll find exclusive content like reading lists from my guests, long-form articles, including my latest, What I Learned from Paul Theroux, regular videos by me, book reviews, and much more. And don't forget to check out my latest book, A Sunny Place for Shady People, the one Paul Theroux called A New Kind of Travel Writing. And now, here's my conversation about Europe by Rail with Nicky Gardner. I think we should start by telling listeners what Europe by Rail is, and please assume that most of them live outside of Europe and might be planning a trip here.
Europe by Rail is a celebration of some of the wonderful things about exploring Europe by train. It's a selection of 50 journeys crisscrossing Europe, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the borders of Russia, from Sicily right up to the far north of Norway and northern Scotland. It is essentially a book about slow journeys, but we realise that sometimes people need to travel quite fast in order to get to places. And above all, the book is part of a wider corpus of work that my partner, Suzanne Kreis, and I have done, exploring personal landscapes and thinking about a particular style of travel, what these days is currently fashioned as slow travel.
Yeah, so what makes train travel here different or unique compared to other parts of the world?
First of all, compared with, for example, North America or Australia or other places your listeners may be, we have a very dense network in Europe. Cross-border rail travel is absolutely the norm. There are millions of Europeans, yes, millions, who every day cross an international border to go to work. And there are many, many Europeans who routinely travel by train. So it's not just the exceptional moment. It is something which is woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. Beyond that, I would say that we have in Europe, we're blessed with a dense network, relatively high frequency of trains on many principal routes. If you think of traveling from Milan down to Rome, you can have a departure every 20 or 30 minutes, from Barcelona to Madrid every 30 minutes. So the capacity of our rail networks in Europe to carry passengers is such that it's hard sometimes for air to compete, especially on shorter stretches.
The character of it also seems different. Like, I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and traveling by train there feels very utilitarian. It's very smooth and streamlined, incredibly fast. It's almost invisible. Like, the delays pretty much never happen. If there's a 30-second delay, there people are apologizing profusely, and even a 10-second delay, and the passengers are checking their watches and getting a bit irritable. So it's almost in the background. But here, traveling by train seems to be a bit more in the foreground. It's part of the experience of the travel, whereas in Japan, it's just something you get over with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think comes to a key point. It's about the tendency in Europe these days to rediscover the pleasure of the journey. Do you remember the time, Ryan, when we all flew much too often and the flight became a enforced interlude between leaving home and getting to the destination? But there's been a reawakening of interest in Europe over the last 20 years in the journey for its own sake. We still want to get places, but sometimes it's just good to take a little bit more time. And let's face it, Europe looks a whole lot better when seen from the train window than when flying over it at 35,000 feet.
Yeah, you also get a much different sense of a country when you enter it slowly. You cross that geography very slowly. The land kind of unfolds before you. Paul Theroux said that you learn so much about a country by crossing the border on foot, and you don't have that sense when you leave one place, especially a distant place, and just parachute into another, jet lagged and disoriented, and into airports that all tend to look pretty much the same.
Exactly. And dare I say, cities, and in particular city squares, that also begin to look the same. So we now have, across many parts of Europe, the popularity with the development in the 1990s of cheap flights meant there developed this huge enthusiasm for city breaks. And the city break formula demanded a nice square, cheap beer, a chance to sit in the sunshine if you were lucky. And this actually hijacked city squares out of the space that belonged to the inhabitants of the city, and they became the property of the people from outside the city who were taking a short break there. And so what you say, I think, Ryan, is absolutely right, that many small and mid-sized towns across Europe, which are close to airports, actually have a similarity about them that actually it transcends the national border. It doesn't matter whether you're in Spain or in Italy or Slovenia. There's something quite similar about some of these city squares and places near airports. The train is, of course, the chance to rediscover the variety of urban landscapes and rural landscapes across Europe because you're no longer constrained to where the airport is. You can stop off anywhere.
Yeah, that early period of low cost flights also brought some a plague of booze tourism too, right? Remember I guess, what do you call it here? Stag and doe parties, stag and hen parties. That,
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
that's just awful. Any of those really cheap destinations, slightly off the track. A place like Tallinn or where else? Dublin was quite bad for that years ago as well.
Dublin very early, and then Tallinn, Krakow,
Yes.
the whole range of cities. I think it was if it was cheap, then people would go there for these stag and hen parties. But nowadays we're seeing, I think, a renaissance of a more enlightened tourism, where people think a little bit more carefully about where they want to go, how they want to get there. And I'm struck by the number of tour operators these days who are beginning to build in rail options. So instead of fly to Sicily and flop and drop for a week, take just a little bit longer and traveling from Berlin to Sicily, which is a gorgeous journey by train through southern Germany, across the Alps, and then down through the Italian peninsula, taking a little bit longer, enjoying the journey, and still enjoying Sicily just as much when you get there.
So you focus on slow trains and local trains quite a bit more than high speed services. Why is that? I think you touched on some of it here, but could you expand on that?
We do have some high speed services, and there is a drama about certain high speed services, I give you that. But I really prefer train journeys where the railway follows the warp and weft of the landscape, that doesn't cut straight through the hills in tunnels, but makes time for the landscape and is generous to the landscape. Let me give you an example. If you're in somewhere, we both live in Germany, supposing you're in Frankfurt am Main and you want to go to Cologne, you have two choices. There is a high-speed line, cuts through the Taunus hills, northwest from Frankfurt. It's very fast and it gets you to Cologne in an hour or 70 minutes. And you arrive there, I find, a little bit disjointed and frazzled. There's been moments of stroboscopic wonder along the way as you get tunnels and then glimpses of sunshine over the hills and so on. But you actually haven't had time to embed yourself in the landscape. So let's propose the alternative, the slower train from Frankfurt that runs west, joins the River Rhine near Mainz, and then follows the River Rhine downstream through the Rhine Gorge with the Lorelei up on your right-hand side through Koblenz, and then down through the landscapes of the Middle Rhine through towards Bonn, landscapes which were celebrated, for example, in the paintings of the English artist J.M.W. Turner. And then you arrive at Cologne relaxed, refreshed, without having a sense of having had to hurry. And it's just so much better than taking the fast train. When I do take fast trains, and my partner and I, we do, to be sure, but I sometimes feel I need to sort of pause to allow my soul to catch up with me when I get to the destination. So if you can, the slower train is always better.
It was also interesting too, the section on Switzerland in the edition that I have. Some of the slow trains parallel these sightseeing routes that cost a fortune for tickets. That all the tourists, was it the Glacier Express is the one that tourists all cram into, and you could just take a local train and recreate that journey without the high ticket prices and without all the tourists.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I have a couple of friends who messaged me this morning. They travelled yesterday on the Bernina route, and they said it's a group of a couple with extended family. So I think there's a group about 8 or 9 of them in all. They said they had a first-class carriage to themselves on the Bernina route, and that's over a summer weekend. So think of that. And had they been on the Bernina Express, the tourist train, they would have been crammed in with foreign faces and so on. I think wrong with that. It's absolutely a lovely experience. But isn't there something wonderful to be by yourself or an uncrowded carriage, to be able to throw open the windows, to be able to lean out, to take photographs? So I would always recommend on Swiss routes to don't hop on the tourist train. Hop on the train which the locals would take. If you're traveling with a Eurail pass or an Interrail pass, there are no supplements on any of these trains. You can't do a seat reservation. There's always empty seats. So just hop on and ride. And that's the beauty of rail travel in Europe, especially with a pass, that you can just travel at will without having to plan too much. And the best journeys are often the ones which are least planned.
So what's the spontaneity versus pre-planning? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each?
Pre-planning brings certainty, but it comes at a cost. One of my favorite historical writers, Théophile Gautier, very notably said, what excitement could there be in a journey when I know where I'm going to sleep tonight? And that uncertainty brings a certain frisson. Now, that said, we do book hotels in advance, but we preserve the possibility on some days of being able to say, let's stay on here for an extra night or two. Let's go for a walk because the weather's on our side, and let's not travel on too quickly. So I'm a great fan of hotels that can be cancelled at the last minute, which is always good. And trying to pack too much in often comes with pre-planning. You know, there's folk wisdom that tells visitors from outside Europe that on a first visit to Italy, you must go to Florence, to Venice, to Rome, to Milan. But I can promise our listeners that's not the case. There is no obligatory rule that says you have to go to all 4, or even that you have to go to any of those 4. So keeping a degree of spontaneity, keeping a degree of freedom, and above all, making space for smaller places where fewer people stop off, where you're more likely to have contact with the local population. Above all, don't stay in chain hotels. Try and patronize locally owned establishments.
I can understand the urge to try to cram it all in. If you're coming from Canada and you might only come to Europe once or twice in your lifetime, I get the urge to see all those sort of major highlights or the UNESCO sites or these sorts of places, but it's often the other places that are far more memorable. And that's the sort of slow travel that we all did in the analog era, when you just went and backpacked around a place and you have an unlimited, well, not unlimited, but you have a lot more time, and you're more prone to spending more time in a random place that you wandered into that just caught your fancy, and you just decide not to move on after that. That freedom to travel slowly like that. It's always those places that stand out in your mind afterwards. The kind of ones that you feel like you discovered that weren't, you know, dictated to you by somebody else or by a checklist.
Yeah, totally. And I have to say, we go back to the same places time and again. We love Switzerland. You'll have discerned that already. And there was one trip I did. I was on my way back from Spain to Berlin, and I just needed a one night stopover. And I chose a little hotel by a railway station in the Laveau Vineyard area. And I chose it, Ryan, to be honest, because of the proximity to the station. And it turned out to be literally 30 meters from the railway platform. So it fitted the bill perfectly. But I have been back there time and time again over a dozen years since, because it's just a nice, relaxed, quiet place to stay. And okay, it's not a 3-star must see in the guidebooks. It's in a beautiful area of vineyards. And from there, I can make day trips to Montreux or Geneva or other of the big star sites if I want to. But I can also just sit on the terrace of the hotel, watch the boats down on the lake, watch the trains go by. It's perfect.
You mentioned stopovers. Each route in the book includes suggested stopovers. Do you have any favorites apart from this one? Like maybe a place that you stopped because you had to and that turned out to be an unexpected gem? That's another one of the benefits of traveling in this way, that you do discover these places.
It is. Well, on one long journey down to Sicily, we had train was running late. We were using passes, so it didn't matter. When we hopped off the train, you wouldn't have to worry about ticketing. And we were going down the west coast of southern Italy, and we stopped off a little place called Tropea, which I had never heard of before. It turned out to have the best onions in the world, and it turned out to be a little gem. We have a great repertoire of places like that where we stopped by chance and they turned out to be absolutely lovely. On one journey down from London to southwest England, the train stopped at a place called Castle Carey, and night was falling. We thought, well, let's just give this place a try. And beautiful little town in northeast Somerset, I would say, not far from Glastonbury. And Castle Carey detained us for 2 nights. And I keep on thinking, gosh, I just want to go back there again. So we have lots and lots of those places, and we slip them into the book with each new edition. We try and update the list of hotels, but we also try and change some of the stopovers. So we give people different options, and the book now in its 18th edition. So over the years, we've had lots and lots of opportunity to change those stopovers.
So I should say that the book covers 50 key routes across Europe, routes that you've come up with that blend practical advice with narrative storytelling. And I wanted to ask you about that actually. How different are the different editions? So do you come up with a lot of completely different routes? Are some sort of standbys that you always would recommend? How different are they?
We're now in the 18th edition. If you go back to the 12th edition, so going 6 editions back, there are really no routes which are duplicated. So all of them have been changed, but we do try and refresh them. The changes from the 17th to the 18th were not so great and were driven actually entirely by pragmatic considerations, Ryan. The deterioration of train services in the Balkans, which I have to say over the last few years have become absolutely woeful, triggered by the pandemic. Large numbers of cross-border services were withdrawn. So we had only 5 or 6 years ago introduced a wonderful route from Budapest to Bar on the coast of Montenegro, traveling south from Budapest through Belgrade, and then southwest, just clipping one corner of Bosnia down into Montenegro and leaving and ending at the coast of Montenegro at the small port of Bar. This was an absolutely glorious journey, which we loved when we did it. But would you believe all the trains from Budapest to Belgrade were cancelled? The Belgrade to Bar bit remained, but then the connecting boat from Bar onto Italy was stopped during the pandemic and hasn't returned. So our changes in the 18th edition were to some extent mediated by having to take things out. And hopefully they'll improve, and whether in the next edition or thereafter, at some time we can reinstate some of those, probably with new stopovers and whatever. But then we always introduce new routes, and over the last year or two, we spent a lot of time exploring France on regional trains. This was driven by something quite particular, that most people in France travel by high-speed trains, and we thought we wanted to use and explore how easy it was to travel through France relying entirely on the regional services. And the answer, it turned out, was it's pretty easy. And a product of that was a new route in the current edition, which goes from Normandy down to the Loire Valley, takes in some of the great chateaux of the Loire Valley, and then travels southeast through Bourges, clips the western edge of the Beaujolais Vert, and goes to Lyon, and then down the Rhone Valley to Valence. So routes come, routes go. We try and give them a twist. Sometimes we have just reversed the direction of the route in the way in which we tell the story about the journey in order to refresh it and make it sound a bit different.
The edition that I had, what's the 15th edition?
So there you are. That's going back a few years.
Yeah, well, I can't part with it because there's so many interesting trips. It's now that you said that there's so much difference in some of the other editions. So you've my work's cut out for me, I think. But there were a number of routes here that went into Russia as well that I suppose are no longer, and to the Ukraine.
Oh, they've gone. I know. We were so proud of the way in which, based upon our own travels, we had two routes into Russia. One which went through Finland, it had connections from Stockholm, going right the way up to northern Sweden, around the top of the Gulf of Bothnia, down through Finland to and then east into Russia. We had another wonderful route from Warsaw to St. Petersburg. This sort of tried to recreate the spirit of the original Great Tsarist Railway from Petersburg to Warsaw. Much of the original route has been closed, but we followed the route using other lines and wrote about that. We had 3 routes into Ukraine at one stage, and we had good coverage of Belarus. We've kept one route into Ukraine in the current edition, and it's just stepping over the border to the city of Lviv. Let's hope better times will come and that we can reinstate more routes to Ukraine, and perhaps going deeper into the country. We've always thought we'd like to do that. And I cross my fingers and pray that every day that a resolution of the current difficulties in Eastern Europe may allow us to rediscover Russia. I think we have to always remind ourselves, Ryan, that the people are wonderful. There's so much to be discovered by there, and you can despise a toxic regime, but still love the people. And that's where we stand on that one.
Yeah, that's the one route that I regret not having done when it was still possible, from Berlin to Belarus, and then stop over there in a couple of cities, and then go up to St. Petersburg. And there was always something we kept saying, oh yeah, we can do, maybe we'll do that one next year, and we put it off, 1 year too many. And
I know. And I mean, we both live in Berlin, so you may remember the time when the only direct train from Berlin to Paris was in fact one that came from Russia.
yes,
And I used it on many occasions. It switched timetable during the years. Sometimes it ran overnight from Berlin to Paris. Sometimes it went by day. And that's something to be greatly mourned, that we've lost in Europe these days, that experience of traveling on Russian trains, which were far from their homeland. So cast back to before the pandemic, it wasn't just Berlin to Paris, but the only direct train from Warsaw to Verona was a Russian train. If you wanted to go on a direct train from Nice to Innsbruck, your only option was to travel with a train run by Russian railways. So let's hope some of these things might come back sometime.
So how different would that have been as an experience?
It would have been very different. Some of these even daytime journeys. I did journeys from Berlin to Hanover on a Russian train, which is a train composed entirely of sleeping cars. So even on a summer afternoon, you can get to lie down between Berlin and Hanover. But Russian trains are different. And one of the things we always say is that the focus of the Russian train is much more on the interior, what's going on inside the carriage, rather than what's going on outside. Perhaps this says something, Ryan, about the fact that Russia has just too much landscape. And let's face it, probably 7 days on the Trans-Siberian from Moscow to Vladivostok, there comes the time when there's too much going on. It becomes boring outside the carriage window, and what's going on inside the carriage is actually perhaps more interesting. So hopefully we'll be able to recapture the Russian spirit in future editions of Europe by Rail. But meanwhile, there's so much to discover: rural Scotland, rural Scandinavia, right down to the Mediterranean.
One of the interesting things too about some of those northern routes is the ability to connect to the Baltic ferry services. So you never have to fly between countries. I did a trip like that once for a magazine story. I drove up through the Baltic countries, but we took ferries from place to place across to Helsinki and the Åland Islands over to Stockholm down to Gotland. You could travel by a combination of boat and train just about anywhere.
Yeah, it's absolutely excellent. And the beauty of traveling with a Eurail or an Interrail pass often works out cheaper than buying point-to-point tickets for each sector, is that many ferries are included, or you get 50% off on many ferry routes. My family, big part of them, live in Scotland. And when I go back from Berlin to visit them, I really quite strongly believe that Britain as an island should be approached by boat. And I occasionally go to Brussels and use Eurostar. But more commonly, I travel by train from Berlin to the Dutch coast and then get the DFDS ferry to Newcastle, or sometimes one of the other ferry routes across the North Sea to reach England. And it's just wonderful. Time out on a boat is just time for oneself. It's an interlude which should just be cherished and enjoyed.
That's another instance too where sometimes the travel experience is superior to or the same as taking one of these tourist services like we talked about for Switzerland. We traveled from the Åland Islands to Stockholm by ferry. I booked a cabin because it was a very early departure and a long day, but I didn't know the cabin was right at the front of the ship, directly under the directly under the bridge, and coming up through the Stockholm archipelago. Like, you couldn't get that on a cruise ship, I don't think. It's an incredible
Oh,
landscape. You're just glued to the
that's
window the entire time.
yeah, it's very nice you mentioned that. That's absolutely brilliant. And gosh, you really lucked out there. I would love to do that. I had a similar experience about 2 weeks ago where we came from Scotland and we had, again, it was on the DFDS ferry from Newcastle to Amsterdam. And we had, just like you described, a cabin right underneath the bridge and coming into the port area of Amaden for the port that serves Amsterdam was just brilliant on a summer morning, and seeing the tugboat hooking up to the ferry and putting it into the berth, and surrounded by a slightly post-apocalyptic world of cranes and piles of containers and a huge steelworks off to the left. But it was just magic. It was really good.
So you mentioned rail passes a moment ago, and most travelers, I think, have heard of Eurail and Interrail. But could you explain what they are for non-European travelers and the pros and cons of using them?
Essentially, a rail pass gives you unlimited travel for a fixed number of travel days over 33 countries across Europe. And for those who live in Europe, the main pass which we go for is called Interrail. For residents outside Europe, the pass is called Eurail. These are effectively brands. Eurail is a very old brand that goes back to 1959 and was absolutely central in shaping particularly North Americans' perceptions of Europe during the Cold War period. Interrail is a slightly younger brand, but still over 50 years old. Interrail Pass scheme goes back to 1972. The two schemes have converged, and essentially the terms and conditions are exactly the same. You can buy as little as 4 days travel. That's 4 days within a 1 month period. Or you can up it and choose 5, 7, 10, 15 days travel. Or you can buy a pass which is available for continuous travel. And that could be 2 weeks of continuous travel, a month, 2 months, or 3 months. As soon as you start to be doing more than 4 or 5 train journeys across Europe, a pass often stacks up to be the cheaper option. I like travelling with a pass because of the flexibility that it gives. And many of the routes in our book, Europe by Rail, presuppose that people will be travelling with a pass, but not all. There is a disadvantage in some countries, and that's that some railway administrations judge that the income they get from the passes isn't quite to their liking. They'd like to get a little bit more, and they start charging supplements for pass holders. This applies in France to people who want to travel on the fast TGV trains. So you pay €10 a shot in order to buy a seat reservation for a TGV. The fee isn't excessive, but it really bugs me that you have to go to the hassle of buying it because it removes the spontaneity of travel. For Eurostar between London and the continent, so London to Brussels, London to Paris, that €10 fee hikes up to €35. In Italy, on the fastest trains, there's a fee of €13. So there are some territories where you have to cope with those fees. But generally, passes are wonderful because they just do give you that sense of freedom, and you can change trains as often as you want. And it does allow you to keep that element of spontaneity.
The other rail passes also exist in different countries, regional passes, country-specific passes, and the range of them is pretty confusing. How do you even begin to sort that out? And comparing that to the Eurail and Interrail.
Yeah, we try and give the basics in our book, Europe by Rail. But to be honest, it's also hard to keep up to date because they keep on changing. Now, I've experienced many times people from outside Germany asking us about the Deutschland ticket. Now, the Deutschland ticket is just a wonderful deal. €58 for unlimited travel in Germany on all buses, all trams, all urban metro services, and on local and regional trains across Germany. It's not valid on the fastest trains, but it comes with a catch. It is effectively constructed as a subscription. It is possible to buy it for just 1 month, but generally it comes as a subscription, so it's not geared for overseas visitors. Elsewhere, you will find passes which are very much geared at the visitor market. For Britain, there is a wonderful series of passes called the BritRail passes. You can buy one that covers all of Great Britain, or you can buy one that covers just England or just Scotland, or for that matter, just Southeast England or day trips out from London. So there's a good range there. There's the Swiss Travel Pass scheme for Switzerland. And there are similar national schemes in Finland, in Spain, and a number of other European countries. People who are visiting cross-border areas, it's well worth looking out for cheap deals and cross-border passes. There's some very cheap passes covering the Czech borderlands, so Bavaria, Saxony, and over the border into Bohemia. There are cheap passes around Lake Constance, so covering northern Switzerland, the southernmost part of Germany, and those parts of Austria that border onto Lake Constance. So it's a good range of passes. Some of them have conditions about not being able to use them before 9 o'clock in the morning, so you don't get tied up in commuter traffic. But let's face it, if you're on holiday, you've got flexibility. You can probably stick around in your hotel and enjoy breakfast and start traveling at 9:01.
So another thing that I really like about the book is that you sometimes follow the route of historic rail journeys, like the Semmering Railway over the Alps from Vienna to Venice and routes like this. So what is it about historic routes that caught your interest?
Well, if you think of the way in which the development of railways, the way in which it took place in Europe, and they absolutely fired the European imagination. And our understanding of Europe today was shaped to a very considerable extent by what happened in the last 3 quarters of the 19th century. This was the era in which the railways developed. The first steam-hauled passenger trains were 200 years ago this year, in 1825. The first railways here in Germany were, I think, in 1835. And by the 1860s, we were seeing a good network of railways across Europe. These powered the economy, they shaped European culture, they allowed interchanges between communities, they mediated huge social change. It became possible for people to start thinking of going on vacation and traveling to coasts and even to other countries. And that, to begin with, was reserved for a more affluent middle class. But under the influence of entrepreneurs like Thomas Cook, great historic name in the history of rail tourism, this really opened up travel for the millions. I think it's worth retracing some of these old routes. Thomas Cook himself published rail guides. The first one was published in 1873, and our book tries to recapture some of the spirit of those early journeys. This is not just nostalgic romanticism. We also understand that the railways powered imperialism. You mentioned, Ryan, in your question there, the route over the Semmering from Vienna. This was a route, let's make no bones about it, which was fueled by Habsburg imperial ambition. The aim was to link the great centers of economic power in the Habsburg Empire in Vienna with Trieste, which was the great port. And so we have to, I think, be aware of that history. There's much in that history which we can follow today and which we can celebrate, and it's still there to be seen by the trackside. The last time I went over the Semmering Railway, I hopped off the train in the village of Semmering itself. This is a wee place in the hills southwest of Vienna as you climb up into the Alps. There's a beautiful memorial there to Karl Geiger, who was the engineer who designed and built the railway for the Habsburg authorities. And these days, there's still something of that Habsburg style to be found in Semmering, as indeed there is to be found at the end of the line in Trieste, where the railway zigzags down from the Slovenian karst to reach the head of the Adriatic and the old port of Trieste, which just oozes Habsburg style.
Well, that's the interesting thing about following these routes as well, because history is unfolding before you, as well as the landscape, and retracing the story of these places embedded within the journey is something I really like. And also, these routes often follow more interesting landscapes. Rather than tunnel under mountains, they wind around them because I guess they couldn't tunnel at that time. So
exactly. One of the trends we're seeing now is, and over recent decades, has been the creation of longer and longer tunnels through the Alps. So if you look at one of the main north-south trunk routes through Switzerland, the Gotthard route, this, I guess, was probably opened in the 1880s. And it was a tremendous achievement. In fact, an achievement which was not just an engineering achievement, but it helped shape Swiss national identity, making access from northern Switzerland through the Gotthard Range to the Ticino of southern Switzerland possible, and uniting the country in a very real sense. The Gotthard Railway is absolutely wonderful. But of course, a few years ago, I think it was in 2016, a new line was opened, and it's called the Gotthard Base Tunnel. It must be about 55 kilometers long. And of course, it is just darkness. You see nothing of the Alps. So we always recommend to our readers, and it's one of the newer routes in the book, that you don't take the new Gotthard Base Tunnel, but you actually follow the old Gotthard Railway, which happily is still open and still served by an hourly train in each direction. So taking the old routes through the Alps. Another piece of advice I'd give to our listeners is if you want to ride the Brenner route through Austria to Italy, do it now or in the next 3 or 4 years, because there's a new base tunnel being built under the Austrian mountains, which will speed you from the Inn Valley down to northern Italy much too fast, and you won't see anything of the mountains in between. So I think, stick to the old routes and you just see a lot more.
In addition to historic routes, you also frequently mention railway stations, and you say that in the earliest days of train travel in great cities, the main station was designed to make a bold statement about that country or a city's status or style or ambition. So could you say more about some historic railway stations?
I think one of the things that strikes visitors from overseas when they come to Europe is that our railway stations are the cathedrals of the industrial age. This is not something totally unique to Europe, because if you think of places like Mumbai, with its glorious main station, Penn Central in New York. So, of course, there were wonderful railway stations elsewhere. But across Europe, railway stations represent the positional statements. They were the representational buildings of the railway companies that built them and nurtured them. And this is not just grand stations. Sometimes country railway stations celebrate the vernacular architecture of the area. If I look at some of my favourite European stations, they are, of course, grand and impressive ones. Antwerp Central is absolutely wonderful. York Railway Station in England. And if you look at what makes York so beautiful, it's actually something quite specific. It is the gentle curve of the train shed, the way in which the tracks curve with a great overarching canopy, the train shed above it. St Pancras Station in London is absolutely glorious as a exuberant piece of Victorian Gothic architecture. But there's also some wonderful modern railway stations. Some of the best modern architects of our era have created superb stations. I think of an architect like Santiago Calatrava, whose railway stations at Lisbon Oriente Station, at Liège, at Lyon Airport are all absolute masterpieces. And then I think also of smaller railway stations, Wemyss Bay in Scotland, little railway stations which you find tucked away in the hills of Bavaria or in rural France. These are just lovely places to sit down and just watch the world go by.
Do you have a least favorite station?
A least favorite station. Yeah, every time I change trains in Paris at Châtelet-les-Halles, I get completely lost. It's all underground. And to be honest, Ryan, I sometimes think there's people who've been down in there for years and years and never found the way out.
There's some really interesting urban rail stations as well. Like Berlin is quite fortunate in that. Some of the U-Bahn stations are really interesting. The different tile work at each station. And
Exactly. Yeah, they're brilliant. I love the line that goes out from the middle of Berlin through Dahlem to Krumlanka, where each station, an architect from a different country was invited to design the station. We've ended up with some real oddities like Dahlem, which has got thatched roofs and looks like a Frisian country cottage, or Krumlanka, which looks as though it should be on the Piccadilly line in London. But there's other stations like Gleisdreieck. I don't know if you've
yes,
ever
yeah.
been there.
That was a frequent haunt for me. Yes, we lived in Kreuzberg before moving
Yeah,
over here. So
exactly. And actually, there's a wonderful short story by Joseph Roth, the writer who for so many years lived in Berlin. He wrote a wonderful short story about Gleisdreieck that just captured the atmosphere of the station so beautifully. So yes, even the unsung station can actually become the fuse to ignite the poetic spirit. And we see that especially well in the writing of the English poet Edward Thomas, perhaps his most famous poem is a poem called Edelstrop. And it's about the day when the express train paused at a red signal at a country railway station in the English Cotswolds. And there was birdsong and there were flowers. And he just glances out of the carriage window and saw the station name Ardelstrop. And then sometime later wrote a poem that celebrated that moment of the express train unexpectedly pausing at a country railway station.
Yeah, these are the things you don't get in air travel, or unexpected pause is quite an unpleasant experience, a plummet, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But I have to say, Ryan, you should also bear in mind that rail travel comes with its disadvantages, like things like engineering work on the track. When did you ever hear a plane being diverted because of engineering work in the sky? So, there is the downside of train travel sometimes.
So one other historical aspect of the book that I also really enjoyed, you have a fascinating sidebar on railway carriages. I'd heard of George Pullman and his famous Pullman saloons, but I'd never heard of George Nagelmacher, although I had, of course, heard of the Wagon Lee carriages. So could you say something about historic railway carriages?
One of the things that's curious for people from outside Europe when they first come to Europe is that we still have in many parts of Europe corridor carriages where you actually have lots of separate compartments. And this is quite a distinctive feature of trains, particularly in Central Europe. And if you think about it, trains in North America developed really rather differently, where the steamship was the model for how the train would look. So there was a much more open look so it was like an interior saloon in the American carriage, whereas it was the corridor carriage which developed more in Europe. Now, since then, of course, in Europe, we've embraced both styles. Nagelmacher's was a very interesting character because he traveled to the United States and he came back to Europe. He lived in Belgium and he had the idea that one could do other things in railway carriages other than just sit in them. One could, for example, introduce dining cars into railway carriages, or one could actually put beds in railway carriages in these compartments. So we owe a lot to Nagelmachers for having given us the sleeping car. And in Europe in the 1880s, when train travel was inevitably slow, and many trains lumbered across many countries, journeys could take 2 or 3 days, the sleeping car was the absolute godsend. It was the godsend for train travellers, but of course it was the godsend for writers and filmmakers, as we see in the film Murder on the Orient Express, the plot of which hinges critically upon what happens in the sleeping car. And I shall say no more because I don't want to break the spell of that story.
I also found it interesting. So you mentioned dining cars were new, but also so were toilets on trains. That wasn't always a feature. I mean, that must have made for some very interesting, tense journeys.
So European rail carriages initially consisted entirely of compartments with no connecting corridor down the side of the carriage. The only way to move between one compartment and the next was to open the door, balance on the wooden running board beside the carriage and walk along to the next compartment. This is something which you should not do at speed. But it could be done, of course, between stations and whatever, at stations. So trains used to have to stop for people to go to the toilet, and train travel was very uncomfortable in the early days. Carriages were not heated. People would be given foot warmers, which had been heated up in hot water at stations, and they were put into the carriages, probably for the passengers paying higher fares, so in first class. And they were put into the carriages at one station, then changed at the next station, so that they could rest their feet on a foot warmer in order to get some creature comfort. In the early days, if you travel by train through some parts of Europe, I think particularly if you look at the main routes from London to Scotland, there are some platforms halfway between London and Scotland, and we're thinking particularly in the South Yorkshire area, where the platform is extraordinarily wide. And there's a reason for that. It's because the train would pull in and 300, 400, 500 people on the train would all get out and they would be served lunch. And there would be the first class dining room, and there would be more picnic fodder for lower class travellers or whatever. And then they would get back into the train in order to travel on. This, of course, was also a good toilet stop. So train travel has improved immeasurably, and we should be very grateful to carriage designers like Pullman and Nagelmachers, who were alert to the importance of making it comfortable in order to get people to adopt the train.
That lack of interior corridors, is that also why they used to sell platform tickets? Because there wasn't any way of checking the ticket once you're on the train? Like the tickets would have to be checked before people get in?
I've never thought of that.
It just occurred to
It's
me now.
possible. Yeah, it is possible. I don't know. I mean, across large parts of Europe these days, stations have become free access zones, so there is no controlled access. But in other countries, like French main stations, many parts in Britain and the Netherlands above all, there is still controlled access. You can't go onto the platform. I like the move to free access. I think it's nice where the station can become social space in which travellers and non-travellers can freely mingle. We see that wonderfully at places like Berlin Hauptbahnhof.
And you mentioned serving lunch on the platform as well. And Nagelmacher's company also opened fine hotels to serve passengers. So the idea of making a journey from city to city and being put up in a fine hotel, this really feels like the kind of things we associate with the golden age of rail travel, that glamour.
Exactly. And, one can still recreate that. It's using our book, you can recreate journeys in which you can still stay at some of those wonderful hotels of the Wagonly era, come out of the main station in Zagreb on the north side and turn left. And across the lawn there's an absolutely beautiful old style hotel. And many others across Europe are still there. And one of the things we try and do in the book is actually to recommend not only these very posh, very expensive hotels of the Wagonly area, but other good accommodations which are within easy walking distance of the station and where it's easy for people to drop a bag, head off and explore a foreign city, and then after a day or two, move on to the next destination.
It reminded me a little bit of the golden age of the very short golden age of air travel, with the clippers and the giant flying boats where they would land in a place where just a random island, Midway or someplace in the middle of nowhere, and there'd be a hotel there and a fine dinner for the passengers and a bed to sleep in, and you continue on the next day.
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting you say that. A few years ago, we went through a place, I think it's called Augusta in Sicily, but I may have got the name wrong. It's called Catania, and it piqued my interest because British Airways flying boats, which were going from London to Southern Africa and to India, used to take off from Southampton Water on the south coast of England, and then their first stop was at Augusta on the east coast of Sicily. And I thought it would be interesting to see what Augusta is like nowadays. It was terribly industrial and an absolute disappointment. Perhaps I missed the best bits, I don't know. But yeah, there were these places which sort of serendipitously appeared on our world maps, which have just totally slipped from visibility.
So you mentioned night trains a little while ago. Are they coming back? Where
They
do you get the
certainly
best
are.
value and the best services on night trains?
Yeah, night trains are back with a vengeance. I have to say, if you ask people, would you love to travel on a night train? They are almost universally enthusiastic and always say yes. When you ask people who have been recently on a night train if they were quite so enthusiastic, sometimes the response is just a little bit more muted. Many people love them. I love them. But I also understand they're not for everyone. One doesn't get a lot of space. And the issue at the moment is we have had this huge upsurge in demand for night trains. And there are not enough good quality sleeping cars around to meet that demand. That has meant a lot of legacy rolling stock, old carriages, which was actually probably carriages which was condemned to be disposed of, actually being brought back into service, being refurbished very quickly. And some night train carriages are just not as nice as passengers really deserve. So choose carefully. Principal night train operator in Europe is a company called Nightjet, which is run by Austrian Railways. And Austrian Railways, OBB, has been brilliant at stepping into that gap and trying to launch a whole series of new night train services. They have ordered a lot of new carriages, and happily, many of them are now coming into service. So if you travel on a night train from Hamburg to Innsbruck or Vienna, chances are you'll get some of the new Austrian carriages, and they are absolutely lovely to travel in. Another absolutely wonderful night train is the Caledonian Sleeper service from London to Scotland. I would strongly recommend, if you use it, doing one of the longer journeys to Inverness or to Fort William or to Aberdeen. The routes from London to Glasgow and Edinburgh are a bit too short for comfort. For me, the perfect night train has to be a train which you can get on at, say, about 7, 8, 9 in the evening and linger on until after breakfast the next morning. I honestly think it's better if you can get 10, even 12 hours on the night train. You get a chance to really enjoy it rather than just to sleep. So those longer Caledonian sleeper routes fit the bill. London to Fort William is, I think, one of the world's great train journeys.
It's interesting too that you see high-speed services expanding all across Europe at the same time as night trains are coming back. I always kind of assumed that the expansion of high-speed rail would mean the death of night trains, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
It certainly was historically. There was a time when almost everyone, if you go back 25 years before the construction of high-speed lines in Spain, almost anyone travelling from Madrid to Barcelona by train would have chosen a night train. There would have been probably about 8 trains a day, of which I guess 6 of them would have been evening departures, because this was a journey which then took anything from 8 to 11 hours. These days, it takes 2.5 hours. There's departures, 4 different companies, each competing with modern high-speed trains and taking 2.5 to 3 hours for the journey. So that spelled the end for the night trains. And it's still the case that night trains work at their best when there's not a competing high-speed line. If you look at the routes that we have from Berlin, you can travel by night train from here to Carinthia, here to Graz in Styria, in Austria. You can travel from here to Stockholm, where we have 2 competing operators, from here to Brussels, from here to Budapest. These are all quite long journeys. And I still think the market for night trains is going to be best, where almost by definition it has to be a longer journey.
So what was your best night train experience?
Oh gosh, I'm struggling. I absolutely loved the night train from Stockholm to Narvik. It's a route that features in some editions of the book. Leaving Stockholm at about 6 p.m. in the evening, and the strangeness of being there, embarking on a real journey of adventure, but surrounded by the prosaic everyday of the evening commute. Just people leaving the office to go home and so on. And that there, tucked away on a side platform, was this Swedish train traveling all the way up into the Arctic Circle. We did the journey in April. Stockholm was already snow-free. But as we travelled north into the evening, the snow got deeper and deeper. The birch trees thinned out. We slept, and the next morning when we awoke, there were reindeer by the side of the tracks. And the wonderful journey over the Afoten barn for the last few hours of the journey got us into Narvik on the coast of northern Norway at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we probably had about 19 or 20 hours on the train, and it was just awesome. I'd do it again tomorrow.
That sounds really great. I've only taken a night train once in Europe. Well, I've taken overnight trains sitting upright. That was long ago. I wouldn't do that again. But I took the Krakow to Lviv years ago, and that's too short because you pass the border, in 3 in the morning or something, and you're woken up by the passport control.
It is. Yeah, it was. And actually, one of the things about that one was that you had the change of gauge.
Yes, yeah.
And that's very noisy. And that's something which these days gauge changing is done with modern trains with so much ease at properly equipped border crossings. But that service that ran from Krakow east into Ukraine probably had 2.5 or 3 hours at the border. And as you
Mm.
like to say, it was probably from like 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning, and you just wouldn't have got a wink of sleep.
No, it's a lot of hammering and banging.
Exactly.
That's a strange experience. The first time I experienced that was in Mongolia, coming from Mongolia into China, and the train passed into a giant shed, and then it was picked right up by a crane.
Exactly.
You're sitting there peacefully, and suddenly you're dangling in the air from a crane, and they swap the wheels out.
Exactly. Yeah. Happily, modern trains can cope with that very easily. Spain was really the pioneer in this because Spain has a rail network at multiple different rail gauges, and therefore it's great if the trains can all run on different tracks. So the Spanish train manufacturer Talgo has been the absolute specialist in making that happen.
I've done a lot of night train travel in other parts of the world, but not so much here. I traveled by train all over China 20 years ago, and before they had high speed rail. So the night trains, you would spend, I think it was from Chengdu in Sichuan province out to Urumqi was about 3 days, 3 days and nights on the
Amazing.
train.
Gosh, you went right out there.
I would say, yeah, from there, another night train to Kashgar, and then traveling
Yeah,
overland around the Taklamakan Desert. And then rather than fly back across China, I took the same train from Urumqi back to the
brilliant.
east. That was really
Gosh.
great. And you have a
Um,
choice between the hard sleeper and soft sleeper, where the soft sleeper was, I think it was 4 bunks and a locking door and quite very comfortable. And hard sleeper was just an open carriage with, compartments of six bunks, and then you
exactly.
step down a
Exactly.
bit, another six. And that was also quite good because you talk to a lot of people. It's very constantly busy, very social, but the train workers are very militant and, scolding you for reading late at night and shutting off all the lights at the same time and waking you up. Like they would wake you up at the crack of dawn because they want to clean up. And if you're sleeping in the top bunk, those lights are right in your face. And
Yes.
I would try to resist until somebody would just come and rip the blanket right off of you, just
Gosh.
slap your feet and say, "Get up."
Yeah, gosh, you capture so nicely. This was actually a feature of train travel in the Soviet Union that persisted into the post-Soviet period. And you captured just there so nicely the character of the communal carriage, platzkarty, it was always called in Russian, whereas you say these shared space that created its own social dynamic and was often very, very interesting.
Yeah, you can still get that in so many different countries. Central Asia was quite good for that as well. And Uzbekistan, these countries have really great railway networks. But back to Europe, so I have two practical questions for you. The first one, I love travel by train, but I found that prices from Germany can be double or triple low cost flights sometimes. During COVID, I went hiking in Slovakia, and the cost of a one-way ticket to Bratislava by train was more than a return flight to from Vienna. So how can I make rail travel affordable on a writer's income?
Book a long time in advance. So often when people say, yes, but it costs so much to travel from here to Bratislava or wherever, you're looking at the prices for next week or for next month. You can book train travel on many European routes up to 6 months in advance and sometimes very much longer. So take advantage of cheap ticketing deals. A journey that I book now for travel in November might cost me €10. If I booked the same journey just a week in advance, it might cost me €150. So there are some real differences there. Think about rail passes. Rail pass may be your best friend, especially for short notice travel, because these come at a fixed price and they don't increase in price closer to the date of travel. Think about the benefits of rail travel. I don't want to preach to you and to your listeners about the green revolution. But we should all be thinking about the way we travel, the impact that we have on the environment. And essentially, there are some costs to air travel, which we're passing on to society as a whole, which we're passing on to the environment. And I think we should all think carefully about that.
So my second question, I'm going to the Pyrenees hiking next week, and I'm taking the night jet from Berlin to Paris, and then I'm traveling onwards to my starting point by TGV because I want to get to the trailhead and start hiking quickly. But the prices were quite good. I booked it quite a long time ago because I knew, when I wanted to start, but I didn't book return tickets because I have no idea how long this hike will take. And I'm flexible on how I get back, but I don't have the cash for expensive last minute TGV tickets. So what would you advise me to do? How do I get home from Bagnols-sur-Mer on the Mediterranean bit of the Pyrenees?
Oh yes, on the lovely place on the Côte Vermeille. Well, I would probably buy an Interrail pass, but the one thing I would think very carefully about is prices on the nighttime intercities. The night trains in France can actually be really quite cheap. So that's one which is definitely worth looking into. There is a intercity de nuit train from Bagnols to Paris. It doesn't run every day of the week. It's a train that starts just south of Bagnols at Cerbère and then runs up the coast to Perpignan and runs overnight to Paris. From Paris, I would think of taking the Ouigo train to Brussels, which is a lot cheaper than the TGV or Eurostar, and again can be booked quite cheaply at short notice. And from Brussels, local trains to the German border, from where the Deutschland ticket is your best friend.
Excellent. I'll make a note of that so I remember when I'm on my way back in sometime in August. So how has rail travel changed in Europe since you published the first edition, and where do you see it going next?
When the first edition of Europe by Rail came out, train travel was really in a decline. It was not in a great place. Budget airlines were blossoming, fares were tumbling in the air, and there were people who, while not predicting the eventual demise of train travel, they were most certainly saying, look, things are going to be tough for rail travel in the future. 25 years on, the scene, 30 years on, the scene has changed entirely. Rail travel is absolutely on the up. We've begun to see much greater flexibility in pricing. I know you were complaining earlier, and people do complain about the price of tickets. But if you go back to the time of the early editions of Europe by Rail, it was basically one route, one fare, two fares possibly. There was a second class and there was a first class fare at a premium. Now we see dynamic pricing, fares tuned to market demand. That creates tremendous opportunity for people who are willing to travel at off-peak times and can get that cheap deal. Trains have become immensely more comfortable. They've become nicer places to be. When the first edition of Europe by Rail came out, the German ICEs hardly existed, only the very first ones. Eurostar was in its infancy. Now we have comfortable high-speed trains where the toilets work. On a good day, the air conditioning works. And if you're very lucky, you will still get a decent restaurant car in order to have a nice meal. So train travel is back in fashion, and that's driven partly by, I think, people's collective concern about the environment, but it's also driven by something we talked about earlier, and that's the revival of interest in the journey, that people want to experience traveling over land and traveling by ferry and to savor the joy of the journey.
So before I let you go, I should also say that you edit and publish Hidden Europe magazine. So what is that, and where can listeners find it?
Hidden Europe magazine was a project which we have run for 20 years, and it was a marvelous endeavor to visit truly offbeat places across Europe. And over the spell of those 20 years, we reported from a Swedish-speaking village in Ukraine, to cultural communities in Iberia, in the far north of Scandinavia, right across the continent. It was a magazine that celebrated cultures and communities and was inspired by our love of slow travel. We brought it to a very planned and gentle end in 2023. And now on the website www.hiddeneurope.eu, we are slowly making available free of charge all of the content that was originally published within the magazine. So it's there for your listeners to discover, and we hope they enjoy it.
Oh, it's wonderful. You can follow the social media pages as well, which I do. It's a great place to get lost. You'll get lost for surprising amounts of time plunging down that rabbit hole. Well, so thank you for your time today, Nicky. It's great to talk to you, and thank you for the inspiration that you pack into each edition of Europe by Rail. I know my listeners are going to love it.
You're really welcome, Ryan. It's been an absolute pleasure to join you here, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.